Welcome to a question and answer episode of the Old Frontline podcast. In these bonus episodes, we'll answer the questions that you pose out of the episodes that we release each week. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast via your favourite platform, and do think about leaving us a review or a star rating. So let's get down to this week's questions. We're back with another questions and answer episode, one of these bonus episodes where we answer your questions posed by previous podcasts or the ones that are out currently now. And this particular Q&A episode officially brings us to the end of Season 6. We've been going for quite a few months now, and we've covered a lot of diverse subjects. We've brought in dispatches this season, the shorter podcasts, and also these Q&As. So there'll be a short break between this episode and the beginning of Season 7, so not long to wait until the Old Frontline returns once more. So let's get down to the questions for this Q&A episode. Remember that you can ask these questions, and the details are in the show notes, via two main routes. One of those is via the Old Frontline Discord server, and there's a link to that, as I say, in the show notes. Or you can click the email link and send a question in via email. And there's a lot come in, some really brilliant ones in the last few days, and we're going to get round to all of them over the course of the coming weeks. So, question 1 is from Stephen via email. He says, I love the Q&A. For me, perhaps like many of the Great War novices, I sometimes struggle to see or visualise where exactly the soldiers stood or where they were that can actually still be experienced today when I visit. For example, the Sunken Lane at Beaumont Hamel. How exactly did they get there? Where exactly were they in the photo? Near the Scots Memorial or further down the lane? Did they attack to the left or the right of the lane, or up the lane or down it? Also, is the Toc H building in Popperinga the original, and did so many soldiers visit that house that exists today, or was it rebuilt? So, great question there. In fact, a couple of questions really, Stephen. For me, having a very kind of visual memory, what I've done over the years is to kind of absorb a lot of the images of the Great War and the maps, and then the stories, kind of these layers we often talk about when we talk about the battlefields of the First World War, and try to somehow attach that to the landscape as it is today. And it takes time, and it's not an easy task sometimes to do. And when you're on the ground, if you're not familiar with the way maps operate, or the orientation, or even kind of which way is north or south, it can be very difficult to really ascertain where things are. And that's one of the reasons why doing tours with battlefield guides, whether a group or an individual guide to take you around in a small group, is really useful, because you've kind of got your own Great War enthusiast in front of you who has done this kind of stuff and knows where everything is. And that's also a good reason to have guidebooks as well, those written by a huge number of different authors. I've written a few myself, but there are so many different guidebooks out there, and they will help you understand that landscape as well. But to answer your specific question about the Sunken Lane at Beaumont Hamel, now for those listening, this was a feature. Sunken Lanes are very much a feature of a chalk landscape, which the Somme battlefields were. And there are quite a few sunken lanes on the Somme. But the famous one is that one at Beaumont Hamel, filmed by Geoffrey Malins in the early hours of the 1st of July, when he went in with his camera and he filmed the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers and the trench mortars and the machine gunners waiting to go over the top. And that sunken lane was actually in no man's land at that point, about halfway between the original British front line and where the German front line was, on the edge of a wooded area close to the village of Beaumont Hamel. And to get there, 252 Tunnelling Company, who had also dug the tunnels and laid the charge for the Hawthorne mine that was going to blow underneath the Hawthorne Redoubt, had also worked on a series of Russian saps, tunnels that would lead from the British front line forward of those positions and the idea was to either blow the exits at the far end to allow people out, or blow the roof off to create an instant communication trench so you can move men up. But in this area, they dug a tunnel that came out in the Sunken Lane itself. And in the early hours of the 1st of July, troops from the Lancashire Fusiliers, and as I say, the trench mortars and the machine gunners who would lead the assault, with half the Lancashire Fusiliers attacking from here and the remainder of the battalion attacking from the original front line. Those troops moved down that tunnel into the Sunken Lane, set up their positions to await zero, and the last man through was Malins with his camera, who filmed them, and then he went back down the tunnel. Military policemen, according to the records, were posted at the entrance to the tunnel to stop anyone else going back down there. But these lads who were in the LFs, the Lancashire Fusiliers, with their supporting troops, were ready for the go. Despite those anxious faces that we see in the Malins film, many of these soldiers were regulars or had served at Gallipoli, so this was not their first time into action. And where they were, if you go to the Sunken Lane today, the best thing is to walk straight up it from where you park near to the memorial to the 8th Argylls. Walk straight up the Sunken Lane, stop just before it bends at the top, and then turn round and walk back. And as you come back down, where the Lancashire Fusiliers were and those other troops was on the left-hand side of the lane. So they were up against the side of the lane that faced the German trenches. That gave them the maximum amount of cover and stopped them, when it got lighter, from being seen by the German positions up on the Hawthorne Redoubt. So if you're going to do a then and now here, you need to come down the lane to the point where the bend straightens out towards the bottom, not the very end of it, but towards the bottom, and on the left-hand side, that is where the Lancashire Fusiliers were. And in the winter months, sometimes, certainly in decades past, you could see a big indentation in the bank on the right-hand side, which is where the tunnel came out. And many years ago, when I was working on my Walking the Somme book, I spoke to some people in Auchanvillers and Beaumont Hamel who said that after the war, that tunnel was filled in with a lot of detritus from the battlefields. And to my knowledge, it's never been excavated. So that's where they were. And then from there, they scrambled up the slopes of that Sunken Lane, up out into the ground beyond, which was waist-high grass of the overgrown fields of what was no man's land, and like so many men that day, walked straight into the German machine gun fire. In the early stage of the battle, I think the Lancashire Fusiliers lost something like 450 men, and their colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Magniac, the Maniac as his men called it, he was awarded a DSO for his bravery that day. But there was very little his battalion could do, and the cemetery that sits there just beyond the Sunken Lane, Beaumont Hamel British Cemetery, pretty much marks the high tide of that battalion's advance that day. Very few men got beyond that, and those that did were killed or wounded, and perhaps even taken prisoner close to the German wire. So I hope that answers your kind of question about the Sunken Lane. And I think if you kind of look at the Sunken Lane and look at the images and the panoramic photographs and the trench maps, and like I say, kind of build up these layers, it's a kind of methodology to use that same kind of information to work on other parts of the battlefield, to understand them and understand where the jump-off lines were, where the front line positions were, and where the Germans were located. And it gives you a greater understanding, I think, of that landscape, an interpretation of that landscape, which is incredibly useful and impactful when you visit that ground today. Now, in terms of the other part of your question about Toc H, Talbot House, now, this was a Belgian townhouse in Popperinge, which was behind the lines in Flanders. And in 1915, two army chaplains, the Reverend PSB Tubby Clayton and the Reverend Neville Talbot, acquired the house from the owners and opened it as a house for soldiers who were out of the line there. They'd initially thought of calling it Church House, but they felt that was overtly religious and might put men off. So instead they called it Talbot House, not after Neville Talbot, but in fact in memory of his brother Gilbert Talbot, who'd been killed near Sanctuary Wood with the Rifle Brigade. And we did a battlefield vlog on that part of the battlefield, and we visited Gilbert Talbot's grave as part of it. The house remained pretty much open for the rest of the war, and thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of British and Commonwealth soldiers went through it during those years. They could go in there, and there was a place where they could write letters, and we give them paper to do that. There was a library where they could read books, quiet room. There was a place in the cellar where they could watch Charlie Chaplin films, a music hall out the back where they could attend shows, or they could go up into the hop loft, the old hop loft, which had been turned by the Chaplins into a chapel where they could attend religious services. And the old house, Talbot House, became a favourite place, a place much frequented by soldiers when they were out of the line. Now, Popperinga in April 1918, with the Battle of the Lys, when the Germans broke through in Flanders and to the south in northern France, the front lines got very, very close to Popperinga at that time. And at one stage it was thought that Popperinga might even fall, but it didn't. It remained a town behind the British line, but in 1918, very close, much closer to that British line. So Popperinga was bombarded, but it was not levelled or damaged anywhere near the extent of Ypres or the villages that had been much closer to the original front line for most of those years of the Great War. So when we go to Popperinga today and we stand in the main square, the town hall and many of the buildings in that main square, the church and many of the buildings just off that main square, they are original. And as you walk down one of those streets on the far side of the square from where the Popperinga War Memorial and the church is located, that's Gasthuisstraat or Hospital Street, that will take you to Talbot House. And it's much recommended, and I think long overdue for a podcast about it as well, but we're going to get to that hopefully in season 7. But the key thing to remember, based on your question, is this is an original building. When you go in through that door, you are walking in the footsteps of those giants who walked before you during those 4 years of the Great War. You're touching the doors and the walls, walking through that space up into the hop loft, just as they did. For me, it is one of the most impactful places off of the battlefields of the Great War, but yet so deeply connected to it. It's a truly incredible experience to go to Talbot House, and you can have a guided tour, you can visit the museum there, and you can go up into the hop loft, and you can stay there. There are rooms that you can rent within Talbot House, and I think spending the night there gives a kind of added dimension to it. So it's totally original, and it's full of artifacts and souvenirs that are linked to its role and its history during those 4 years of the First World War. So I hope that helps, Stephen, and we're going to move on to question 2 now, which comes from Adam Bootle via email. I live in Essex between 3 Royal Flying Corps / RAF Great War airfields, Hainault Farm, Sutton's Farm and Stowe Maries, but have never heard or seen much mentioned about World War I airfields on the Western Front other than in books dedicated to that niche. Nor have I seen mention of people on social media having visited sites. Do any traces survive in Europe? I appreciate that most would have been sited on flat arable land and were likely to have been returned to farming use relatively quickly after 1918. Are there any memorials to units, pilots, observers? Well, again, this is a kind of fascinating question about the war in the air. I remember many years ago, John Giles, the founder of the Western Front Association, who had written books on the Western Front and the war beneath the Western Front, and he always said, don't just look at the terrain, don't just look at the ground beneath the battlefield, look above the battlefield as well. To understand the war, you have to understand the war in the air as well. And it is vitally important to our comprehension of what that war was about and the way the war in the air transformed from aircraft being used solely for observation at the very beginning of the war to bombers being used to bomb enemy territory by 1918. But what trace is there of it today? And that's a good question. Well, a lot of these Royal Flying Corps, later RAF, Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service combined on the 1st of April 1918 to create the RAF. These airfields were temporary in most cases, with temporary structures. So big canvas hangars or wooden affairs, wooden huts and this kind of stuff. And there's almost no trace of that. It's not like World War II airfields where you'll find dispersal bays with big earth banks and things like this. that doesn't exist for the airfields of the First World War, but you can trace aspects of them. So if you go out of Amiens and go up to Vert Galon Farm, which was a famous airfield where number 56 Squadron flew from for a chunk of the war, and very experienced and well-known pilots were members of that squadron and flew from there. You can look at some wartime photographs, and it shows some of the farm buildings at Vert Galon being part of the aerodrome, and they are still there today. So there are quite a few locations like that where existing buildings that were there during the Great War, and these airfields tended to be behind the lines because you couldn't land an aircraft in no man's land without it getting chewed up by artillery fire, and they weren't there to do that kind of stuff. So airfields were away from the battlefield, and that means these were not places pummeled to bits by artillery. So if there are buildings in the photographs of these airfields, pretty much with a bit of modern development, some places disappear, but pretty much they are still there. And another example of a famous aerodrome from the Great War that's easily accessible is Mont Saint-Éloi near Arras, the twin-towered abbey, damaged, almost destroyed by shell fire in the battles of 1915, and then a Royal Flying Corps and later Royal Naval Air Service aerodrome was in that little hollow beneath the ridge, beneath the twin-towered abbey, and that is a place where there are photographs of it, there are accounts of it, memoirs of people who flew from there, so it kind of connects us, this layers again, kind of connects us to that bit of the landscape. So you're not going to kind of see the sort of remains on airfields that you would do if you toured the airfields of the mighty 8th, the American 8th Air Force, in places like East Anglia, or Bomber Command's airfields up in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire and places like that. It's not on that kind of scale in terms of what remains. But there are some very good guidebooks. Pen and Sword published a whole series by Mike O'Connor, which kind of looks at the war in the air and where these aerodromes and where these fighter pilots fought. You asked a question about memorials to them. There aren't specific memorials to individual pilots, with a few exceptions. Albert Ball, who's buried in a German cemetery, has a unique headstone memorial really on his grave, but his crash site was marked by his family, and although only one part of that memorial on his crash site remains, you can go there out in the fields not far from where he's buried to see the exact spots where his aircraft crashed. So there's that kind of thing. And if you go to Saint-Omer, there's a new memorial, I think it was put up during the centenary, commemorating the use of Saint-Omer Airfield by the Royal Flying Corps and the RAF during the Great War. It would, of course, go on to be used again in World War II and extensively by the Luftwaffe during that period as well, and later 2nd Tactical Air Force as the Allies swept through there in 1944. So the later history of the aviation side of the war within Europe in a conflict a generation later in World War II often kind of overshadows some of these Great War sites, but it is possible to kind of do a tour around these locations. And in fact, through our Ledger Battlefield tours, we have actually done air war tours where we've gone to the sites of airfields, gone to some of these memorials, and gone to cemeteries. And the Arras Memorial, the Air Services Memorial at Arras, which has got Lano Hawker VC, which I mentioned in a recent podcast, and Mick Mannock VC. You can go to Wavre, where Jimmy McCudden is buried, and the kind of list goes on of these famous pilots who flew. You can kind of put together quite a good itinerary, and it's a really interesting and unusual way to look at the landscape of the old front line from the perspective of the war in the air. And perhaps I kind of think that these Q&As are often popping up ideas for future podcasts. Perhaps there's an air war over the Western Front in a day kind of podcast that could be down the line. Who knows? Our next question comes from John Thompson, also an email. He says, I'd read somewhere that the highest percentage of British soldiers killed during the First World War were commissioned officers leading from the front. I think the figure was around 25%. These officers came from the most powerful and affluent families in the UK. With this being the case, was there ever any uproar back in the UK from their families demanding an end to the war, especially in the early years of the conflict, and was there ever any serious peace talks prior to the armistice in 1918? Well, kind of a two-aspect kind of question there, John. In terms of the officers, there's some really great books on this. John Lewis Stimple wrote a book called 6 Weeks, and the title of it relates to the average life expectancy of a young officer on the battlefields during the Great War, which was 6 weeks. Now, they weren't all killed in 6 weeks. Men would become casualties, and that means killed, wounded, captured, or sick, because some men could go sick, particularly in the winter periods, just as much as they could get killed by a shell, wounded by a rifle grenade, gassed, or nabbed in a German raid and dragged off to a prisoner of war camp. So the casualty rate was high. I'm not sure 25% were actually killed. There was a huge number of officers killed in the First World War, but the kind of level of casualties, particularly amongst regimental officers in infantry battalions, was very high, because these were men who didn't say to their troops, "Okay, lads, the enemy is on that hill, off you go." They said, "Okay, lads, the enemy's on that hill, follow me." And they were first over the bags, first out into no man's land, forward of their men, leading them into action. If you take a classic kind of account of that, which is the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where battalions went over the top with the commanding officer and often the second command out in front, sometimes the adjutant there as well, the companies coming up behind them with the company commanders forward, and the platoon commanders in front of their platoons. And once the machine guns and the shells and the mortars begin to drop, these men become casualties very, very quickly. And there were a staggering number of battalions on that first day of the Somme that went over the top with 20-odd officers, and all of those officers became casualties, either killed, wounded, or missing. So setting an example, which was really expected of officers, is what cost them those terrible, terrible casualties in the Great War. And not every officer was from a powerful or affluent family. Quite a lot of the officer veterans that I interviewed, Malcolm Vivian, he was from quite a wealthy family, an old Cornish family that had existed in Cornwall. I think the oldest Cornish family, the Vivians, and they have a family seat at a place called Trellar Warren. But there were other lads like Jimmy Lovegrove, Smiler Lovegrove. He was just an ordinary middle-class lad from a London suburb. His parents weren't that wealthy. They rented their house. His dad was a kind of businessman, but they didn't have any kind of sizable money. He wasn't privately educated. He was commissioned in a period of the war towards the end of it when that wasn't a requirement to become an officer. So not every officer was a toff, basically. But in the early phase of the war, there was a requirement that you had to have gone to an approved school, a school approved by the War Office. And that didn't mean Bognor Regis Baptist School. It meant Eton, Harrow, and all those other kind of public schools that officers, senior officers, junior officers who just left them had gone to in those decades before the Great War. So what that meant was, with the high level of officer casualties, as you hint at, John, there was a high level of casualties amongst the aristocracy in the Great War. And there's a really superb book by Gerald Glidden called The Aristocracy in the Great War, in which he looks at this and the impact that it had on them. It devastated them. I mean, how many National Trust properties are out there because ownership of the National Trust, because young men died on a battlefield and there was no one to inherit that estate and carry it on. So it had a devastating effect, but there is no evidence, as far as I know, that any of those titled families and the aristocracy or families with money made any kind of effort to influence the government to bring the war to an end. And there were occasional peace talks. Germany, I think, brought peace talks to the table about a year or so before the war came to an end, but the Allies felt that they were in a much more kind of powerful position at that point, and the terms that the Germans were offering were not accepted, and the war continued. The Germans wanted to walk away with a lot of land, probably retain Alsace-Lorraine, retain land that they'd captured on the Eastern Front. So it would really, the only way this war could come to a conclusion was complete and utter capitulation or defeat of Imperial Germany and all of her allies, which is exactly what happened in the late summer into the autumn of 1918, with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the defeat of the Turks in the Middle East, and eventually the defeat of Germany on the Western Front. So again, an interesting subject, and the whole idea of officers only surviving for 6 weeks is something that we will return to in a future podcast yet again. We're promising quite a lot for this next season or so, but we'll get there. So our fourth and final question for this Q&A episode comes from Alan F. on Discord. I often hear stories about the weather on the old front line. One data point I saw said it rained or snowed 42% of the time. Even those of us who have spent time on the battlefields feel the sudden changes in weather. I'm curious about your perspectives on how the soldiers on the front line adapted to the various types of weather throughout the Great War on that front line. Well, again, a brilliant question. Weather is a massive part of the experience of soldiers and the conduct of battles. Rain can change a landscape completely, as it did, for example, during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, the wettest summer in living memory, that in combination with the huge artillery bombardment and the destruction of all the natural drainage by that bombardment, resulted in that ground being sodden with rain and turning it into this vast lunar landscape of liquid mud and muck and slime and everything we kind of associate with the Third Battle of Ypres and the approaches to the village of Passchendaele in 1917. But those kind of conditions were not unique to that battle or even that part of the Western Front. You don't have to go far in the accounts of that war to find similar conditions on the Somme. Norman Gladden, who I knew and who wrote several books about the First World War, including one called Somme 1916, very much relates those kind of experiences in the mud and the rain and the slime on the Somme in that late autumn of 1916. The conditions then, I think, for some soldiers on that battlefield were probably as bad for them as those who fought at Passchendaele the following year. And then, of course, that winter of 1916-17 is often described as the coldest winter of the war, when it dropped to below minus 25. Someone sent me some weather reports for that region some time ago, which shows some slightly warmer temperatures, and by warmer I just mean a few degrees difference with that, but it certainly shows the winter of 1916-17 was a very, very cold winter. And we know from the accounts and war diaries that soldiers froze to death in the front line. Pollard in Fire Eater describes the freezing conditions at the front up on the Ancre Heights around Beaucourt and Ballascourt Farm. Henry Williamson talks about this in his memoirs. And weather generally was something that the veterans that I interviewed all those years ago often spoke about. I mean, being predominantly them being British, it is a subject that British people often discuss, whether in peace or in war, and discuss it they did. I remember Albert Bamfield of the 13th Royal Sussex described how when he was in a wet, muddy trench and the rain was absolutely pelting down, it was pinging off of his steel helmet. He had his helmet kind of perched downwards, so the rain came down the curve of the helmet and dripped off the end of the rim down into the trench. But the impact of the rain against his helmet created this kind of ping noise. And years later, he had a little lean-to on the back of one of his houses. And every time it rained and the rain pinged off that lean-to, it transported him back to the Somme or Ypres and all those other places that he'd served as an infantry soldier during the Great War. But it wasn't just the cold, it wasn't just the rain, it wasn't just the mud. It could be equally as difficult for soldiers when it was hot. The first day of the Battle of the Somme was that perfect summer's day. We often see that written about in many accounts in Martin Middlebrook or Lynn MacDonald or memoirs that recount that day. And think about it, it was a really hot, warm day, and you're a wounded Tommy out in no man's land, crawled into a shell hole to get some shelter so you didn't get fired at by the enemy once more. You're going to very quickly get through your water under those conditions, and it being so hot is going to make it even more miserable for you. And water under those kind of conditions was difficult. Again, one of the veterans I interviewed was in a Scottish battalion, went over the top in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. It had been raining for a few days, and the weather then could often contrast rain and then intense heat. and it was hot on this particular day that he'd gone over. He got cut off from his platoon, sheltered in a shell hole, and his water ran out very quickly. They'd always been told, do not drink shell hole water because it could have gas in it and it will kill you. But he couldn't resist. He drank some of it. Then he fell asleep. It was night time. He woke up in the morning and the water level had dropped a little bit in the shell hole, and to his horror, he looked down and saw half of a Gordon Highlander at the bottom of it. So I'll kind of end that description and kind of insight into weather with that account, with that on your mind. But again, it's a fascinating subject, and weather is such an important part of it. And there are records of the weather in official archives, and it's something really that I think needs to be studied more, particularly as to how it affected soldiers in those forward positions and how it affected the outcome of operations, both on the extremes of weather with extreme cold and wet and extreme heat. Of course, that applies to other theatres of war like Gallipoli, Salonika, Italy, Mesopotamia, and so on. So that's where we end it this week. A little bit longer than usual, but we've had some really interesting questions there. Keep the questions coming. This is the end of Season 6, and I'll see you soon for Season 7 of The Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline.